Hello. Okay, so this is prompt 2. I'm going to go through this presentation. So prompt 2 really focuses on reflecting on lessons and instructional practices. So what is reflective practice? According to Matthew, reflective practice is the ability to reflect on an action to engage in a process of continuous learning. It involves deliberately reflecting on experiences, which is essential for learning, as experience alone does not guarantee it. Okay, so reflective practice allows teachers to better understand their craft, address challenges, and identify the root causes of the issues. Through reflections, teachers can develop and implement action plans that lead to meaningful improvements in the classroom. By engaging in this practice, teachers not only strengthen their own skills, but also ensure that they are meeting the needs of their students. How I do reflection in my classroom, even though I've been teaching, this is my 10th year, I'm continuously learning every single year and reflecting on lessons that I've taught. Reflection plays a critical role when I'm planning with my students. I'm able to see what worked well in my lessons, what challenges may have come, how my students have responded, and then this helps me to identify strategies that effectively support my learners and where I need to kind of adjust my lessons in the future. So reflection can also give me an insight into the students' needs. It analyzes their engagement, their understanding, and their performance. I can make more informed decisions about differentiation, pacing, instructional strategies, and over time, this cycle of reflection and adjustments has just made me more intentional in my teaching in the classroom. So reflection is just not something that I do occasionally. I do this every single day. I do this with every single lesson, so that I can reach my students in the best possible learning experience. So how do you utilize peer experts in becoming a better teacher? So last school year, I transitioned from teaching in kindergarten and first grade to third grade. And so I relied heavily on my peers and my third grade team to sit down in PLCs and go through the standards and implement, what strategies they've worked in their classroom that have worked with this age group. It doesn't seem like it's a big jump going from first grade to third grade, but it is a huge jump. The students are more independent. However, I do work with the EIP third grade, so my students are a little bit lower than the average third grader. So having my experience in kindergarten and first grade has really helped that. So I'm able to contribute that aspect to my team and kind of break down the third grade standards a little bit more than what they're used to. So it's so important to have a team that is collaborative and supportive. There's teachers that have been teaching for a while and they have strategies that they've seen that work, and then there's teachers that are new and they have fresh ideas, and it's really important to collaborate together and make sure that we have the students' best interest in mind. So prior knowledge. In what capacity does your prior knowledge and student experience influence your own growth as a teacher? So my prior knowledge and student experience has been central to my growth as a teacher. The background that I bring from teaching multiple grade levels, kindergarten and first grade, has helped me to build a strong foundation for understanding the skills and the basic skill set that these students were supposed to learn and learned in kindergarten and first grade. This has allowed me to anticipate where students may struggle, and it helps to build on the lessons because continuously the standards are building every single year. It takes one skill and it builds on it over multiple years. So equally important are the experiences that I've gained directly from working with my students. Each class has a unique set of strengths, needs, and personalities for sure. And learning to adapt instruction to meet those differences has pushed me to grow in flexibility and creativity in my classroom. Each year, my students have taught me something about patience, resilience, and the power of relationships in my classroom. Together, my prior knowledge and student experience influence how I approach teaching every single day. They encourage me to reflect on what has worked, adjust what has not worked in the past, and continue learning alongside my students. Ultimately, these experiences have shaped me into a more responsive, confident, and intentional educator. So here's my lesson overview. So the lesson that I chose to reteach was a measurement lesson, introducing measurement, and I taught this lesson last year in August of 2024. This is when I had first moved from from first grade to third grade. The objective of this lesson is for students to be able to estimate and measure liquid volumes, lengths, and masses of an object using customary units. For this lesson, I used our county math resource, which is called Big Ideas. This lesson functioned well, and my students did really well on the summative assessment. But as I reflected from last year and my changes to this year, knowing what my students are supposed to learn by the end of the year and going through a full year teaching third grade, there are a little more adjustments that I've made when I decided to teach this year in August of 2025. So for measurement, the student should be able to compare sizes of units of lengths, identify which unit to use to measure a length, and then estimate a length. The learning target is I can understand and estimate length in customary units. How successful was I at addressing all learners? So this lesson was fairly successful when addressing the diverse needs of learners in my classroom. So I incorporated modeling and guided practice, which supported my EIP students. Sometimes I have to do a little bit more modeling than my colleagues who have the average group of third graders. It just depends. But by providing these clear step-by-step instructions and using a lot of visuals, I helped ensure that all my students could follow along and engage with the concept. And I also offered opportunities for peer collaboration, which allowed students to learn from each other and build confidence through discussion and practice. So here's some strategies that worked. I'm just going to name just a few. So the strategies that did work is some hands-on measurement practices. Students are more engaged when they're using tangible items such as yarn, rulers, yardsticks, instead of just solving textbook problems. Students love to work in groups. They like working with one another, and I've learned that if you can teach something, you have mastered the concept. So I like to see my groups collaborate, so I'm able to get a better sense of who has mastered the concept and who is struggling just a little bit. I like to use anchor charts as visuals, and I like to leave these up throughout the year so my students can make references to them. And I also try to incorporate some real world examples. For example, the quarter showing the inch, notebook being equivalent to feet, a baseball bat being equivalent to a yardstick, and then football field being equivalent to miles. This especially helps my EIP students if they can picture something that is in the real world that they've seen before. Some strategies that did not work is the estimation. I didn't realize how much of a struggle it is for students to estimate. Students estimate object lengths, but they didn't really have the chance to measure them after they've estimated. Some of my students, I noticed that they had a tough time with estimating and making a knowledgeable guess, an educated guess about something. Also, strategies that did not work, introducing multiple vocabulary terms at a time. It's overwhelming for my students, I've noticed that, and they kind of get their words jumbled up together. So that's just a few. This lesson was about 45 minutes to teach. How did your strategies for integration work with this lesson? So it worked pretty well. I incorporated reading and discussion around measurement, vocabulary. Students, they were able to make stronger connections between math and literacy. They were able to see that math and literacy can go hand in hand. The strategy supported student engagement and allowed them to apply math in meaningful ways. It gives them a purpose. A lot of students are always saying, why do I need to know this? So I tried to incorporate, some different content and explain to them real life reasons for why they would need to know this. So as I reflect, I recognize that integration across content areas could be strengthened. So while math was clearly the focus, science and writing connections were less emphasized a little bit. For example, the students could have collected measurement data during a simple science experiment and then wrote about it in their process. using explanatory writing. This would have provided opportunities for cross-curricular skill development while reinforcing the math concepts. Moving forward, I plan to design activities that intentionally connect math to science, literacy, and sometimes even social studies. Let's see. So here's some of the artifacts that we used. This is for my original lesson. This is the Big Ideas activity pages from the student's workbook. So if you look through my lesson plans, you will see that this is more of like the warm-up. Students are able to go around the room and find an object that's shorter than the string, and then it moves into the teacher modeling and using this visual guide as how the students are able to measure using length, inches, feet, yards, and miles. And then it goes into a little bit of the guided practice. So, and with the guided practice, I like to do like 3 to 5, maybe like 3, 4, and 5. Have the students, split those up and do 3 and 4, and then we'll check them whole group. And then have the students, maybe introduce number 5 together and guided, and then have the students do 6, 7, and 8 by themselves. Number 9 is a little, I would say that's very rigorous and something that the kids are going to have to be the teacher and think more in depth, that higher order thinking questions. Here's some anchor charts that I used. I like to use this conversion just so that they can see, and I also like to have hands-on measurement items for them to use. And then this, I just printed this off into a poster and posted this on the wall because it went with our Big Ideas lesson. Then for the formative assessment, this is the homework and practice page of the Big Ideas activity workbook, and I gave this to the students for them to do independently, and then I would check it. So when I revisited this lesson, everything that I've talked about previously, that is what I did in August 2024. Now, August 2025, this is my revised lesson where I've changed it a little bit to have more of a hands-on science lab, where my kids are going to estimate, measure, and record the lengths, the masses, the volumes of real-world objects in our classroom using these customary units. So I'm going to group them into maybe a few groups, 3 or 4. They're going to compare estimates to actual measurements. They're going to calculate the difference and then reflect on their findings using their academic vocabulary. I'm going to incorporate math, science, and literacy to hopefully increase some engagement, encourage them to collaborate, and then make sure that their measurement skills are more meaningful. So the teaching revisions for this revised lesson, the students are going to be asked to estimate the length, mass, or volume of real-world classroom objects around the room, measure the same object with the appropriate tools, so like a ruler, a yardstick, measuring cup, scale, etc. Record their estimates on a chart that I've made, compare their estimates to the actual measurements by calculating the difference, collaborate in their small groups, and share roles to discuss which units were most appropriate for the different objects. And then at the end, I'm going to have them write a reflection or a short explanatory sentence about their findings. For my EIP classroom, I could provide, or I will provide them with a sentence frame. My estimate was blank because the actual measurement was blank. I learned that scientists use exact measurement because, etc. And then just make sure the students will apply the vocabulary in both discussion and writing. So, what was successful? The revised lesson was more successful because it transformed a skills-based math lesson into a multidisciplinary hands-on investigation where students practiced not only measurement, but they also were thinking like scientists, but then communicating like writers. Sorry. All right, revisions for the cultural diversity and community engagement. So the cultural diversity and community engagement wasn't necessarily a central focus of this measurement lesson, but I worked to include elements of a student's background knowledge and their real-world relevance. By choosing everyday objects that they see in the classroom and familiar context for measuring, I'm aim to make the lesson accessible and meaningful to all of my learners, regardless of cultural or linguistic background. I was partly successful where students were able to connect to the lesson in their daily experiences, which increased participation, understanding, and curiosity. What determines success? I think to determine success, I looked for evidence in student engagement for sure in the groups, making sure that everybody had a role, everybody was engaging, not one person's doing all the work. That goes with participation. Everybody is fully engaged in a meaningful conversation. And then the assessment at the end is going to engages the success. So nearly all my students were actively involved in group discussions, and they completed their charts. Their reflections showed growth in both accuracy and vocabulary. Students demonstrated enthusiasm while they were making these classroom measurements and experiences at home. For example, we were talking about if you were to measure the earth, the actual earth, would you use inches? Would you use miles, yards? What would you use to measure the earth? And then we compared that to how many laps around a football field is 1 mile. So, we talked about which is the biggest measurement unit for the kids to use. And some of my football players that I have really, were thinking, wow, I got to do 4 laps around the football field in order for that to be 1 mile. How many, miles is Earth long? So then we were kind of able to take that lesson and think and, do some further investigating to find answers for that. And they really seemed to enjoy that. Teacher reflection, changes in student engagement. So originally I had engagement which came from comparing the yarn to objects and then just using some anchor charts. But I noticed that a lot of my students, they're losing focus with just the workbook style independent practice. So when I revised it and had them working in groups and they were measuring multiple things and using different types of measurement tools, the students were staying more engaged, they were more active, and it was more appealing to my hands-on learners, and they were able to actually see that this is measured and this is how long it is. Curiosity. So the interest was steady in my original one. Kids, like I said, they thought that it was really cool seeing that a mile is 4 laps around a football field. But whenever I revise a lesson and use some more real-world objects that are in our classroom, like the chair or their desk, it sparked more curiosity, and they were saying, well, what if we put all of our desks together? How many yards or how many feet is that going to be if one desk is this long? So, and then there's just some other ways that the students were engaged. Some of the students, they don't like really doing repetitive activities. I do this page, you do this page kind of thing. They like being up and doing hands-on, having things in their hands to keep their attention high. So I integrated, like I said, the science and the literacy. So I integrated investigate properties of matter and how they can be measured. And then the writing is to write informative text to examine a topic and convey ideas clearly. Learning experience summary. Overall, this lesson was engaging and pretty effective for my students. They were active participants in estimating, measuring, and recording data. They showed excitement with the hands-on approach. They were excited to not, get their math books out, which, we have to do for some, but they like to get a little bit more in depth and get their hands on the materials. The integration of science and literacy gave them multiple ways to interact with the content, and the lab chart provided structure that helped most students stay organized. Collaboration in the small groups allowed for peer support. Many students demonstrated strong use of measurement vocabulary. I was very impressed with that. And while the majority of my students were successful, individual differences highlighted areas for growth in how I met my diverse learners. So I'm going to jump down here to the struggling student. So I realized that one of my students who is an ELL learner found the reflection writing portion a little challenging. So while he was able to measure accurately and get those, estimates and measurements correct, it was hard for him to kind of put that into words. So to better meet the needs of my students, I provided some sentence strips and bilingual vocabulary cards for him to use and connect that with our English ones to support language development without reducing the rigor of the task. So additionally, I just gave him a little bit more support for the, the English to Spanish ratio, what he was struggling with, to put his thoughts into a reflective essay using English. So one of my successful students, who she normally struggles with different math concepts, she excelled in this lesson because it was hands-on instead of just looking at the book. She was able to physically measure objects and record the results, and the students connected math to a tangible experience. So to extend the learning for the student, I could provide opportunities to apply measurement in real-world projects, such as if she was going to bake a cake, or sports statistics, which builds on their interest and their cultural relevance. So the student work samples from the lesson revealed important trends. Many students demonstrated accuracy in their measurement, and they were able to compare their estimates with actual results. However, there's always going to be some gaps in the EIP classroom. So there was a little bit of gaps in recording their data correctly, and their reflection sentences were often incomplete, or they might have lacked a little bit of use of the key vocabulary. So this suggests that while the hands-on portion of the lesson supports engagement, the transition to written explanation was a challenge for my learners who needed just some additional scaffolding. Several students also relied heavily on teacher prompts and sentence starters when choosing the correct unit of measurement and writing that down. I did notice that some of my students were forgetting to put the units which they measured. For example, if they measured and it was 3 feet, they would just put 3. And so that's something that in the future I know that I need to emphasize more on, making sure that you put the units. As a EIP teacher, my goal is to reduce barriers and build confidence in these kids' foundational math skills. By analyzing their student work, I can see that my EIP students need more structure, support, in vocabulary, recording, and making connections to their own lives.